right, thank you for staying with us on Citizen Weekend. As promised, we have Fergus Kell, Research Fellow, Africa Programme, Chatham House, joining us from London. And we have Nicodemus Minde, Researcher, Institute for Security Studies. And we're reflecting on the Tanzanian elections. I'll start with you, Nicodemus. You were in Tanzania for the elections. What was the turnout like? I asked that question because today when the results were being announced as Samia Suluhu Hassan was being declared winner of the presidential election, they said over 31 million participated in the vote out of a possible 33 million.
Actually, the turnout must have been very low. These numbers come as as a surprise. Why do I say that is the case? Because the protests began at around 11. Of course, they began way earlier. By the time the protest had gotten some form of momentum, not many people went actually to vote. And of course, we saw ballot boxes being taken by the protesters and an attack on various polling stations. So it comes as a surprise that we hear that the turnout, the official figures is around 85, is it 87%, the numbers given by INEC. And of course, with the registered voters being 37 million, and now the president-elect being declared with about 32 million. It's quite surprising, to be honest, that they put these numbers. So I also need to also mention that there was also, while it was, they spoke about the need to go and vote, but there was some form of apprehension, and many people were a bit afraid not to go and vote. And then, of course, I thought it would have been affected by the opposition clamor for the no reforms, no elections. But again, INEC has said that it's about 32 million have actually gone to vote, which again, to me, I think it's quite surprising.
Because what you witnessed was a low voter turnout.
It was a low voter turnout.
All right. Fergus, I'll ask you to come in at this point. You've been writing about these elections before they happened, these anticipated elections. Were you surprised? Did you anticipate that there would be protests?
Well, I think as researchers, we need to admit when things do surprise us. And I think in this case for Tanzania, the scale of the protests did surprise me. I was expecting some demonstrations. They'd been announced online beforehand. But I do want to emphasize that the scale and the scope of these demonstrations is really unprecedented in Tanzanian history on the mainland. So yes, that element did very much take me by surprise. I think looking back, opposition Chadema did try to get people out on the street early last year when their negotiations with the government started to fall apart. There was very limited turnout at that point. But I think really what is the driver of such a big demonstration turnout this time around is the fundamental lack of choice, the fact that people feel that there is no realistic option for them to exercise their choice and decision-making at the ballot box. So in that sense, it's not surprising that people felt that they needed to exercise that feeling.
Now, even before this election came up around, you had raised some concern about the nomination process without CCM, as did Nicodemus. Perhaps you can explain that to us, Fergus?
Sorry, to explain the nomination process?
Yes, your concerns around the nomination process.
Well, within CCM, CCM has a long history of internal democracy, of healthy competition within the party for the presidential nomination. And this year, President Samia was announced as the party nominee back in January. That's also unprecedented in CCM history that they've done it that early. It's normally a process in June or July that goes to vote at the party Congress. But actually, I think it's important, just to clarify there, that my criticism is not purely of Samia's process this year, but actually, if we look back to 2020, when John Magufuli was contesting for re-election in Tanzania, he effectively banned the only potential challenger internally from the party, Bernard Membe, was cast out of the CCM in February before any sort of nomination process could take place anyway. So the outcome is basically the same within the CCM. There has been a decline in that internal democracy process within the CCM over the last decade, and President Samia is the latest manifestation of that, but she's not unique in that sense.
Fergus has that opinion, that's his take. Do you share it?
Of course, Tanzania's democracy has also benefited a lot with internal CCM democratic process. But as Fergus has shared and was mentioned, there's some form of deterioration in that internal party democracy in the way they nominate the candidates, not just at the presidential level, but also at the other, members of parliament and other positions. And of course, this has come, it affects the democracy of Tanzania. For example, in this year, traditionally, CCM goes through a nomination process in which candidates pick forms. But again, we saw some form of hijack of the process early in January, and of course it barred all potential contestants within CCM to really challenge President Samia. And of course this is some of the criticisms that has been raised by various critics who have since then either been expelled from the party or suspended and so on and so forth. So Tanzania's democracy has always depended or thrived with CCM democracy, and we have seen the deterioration of CCM democracy affecting Tanzanian democracy as a whole.
Fergus, do you expect the center to hold within CCM or a fracture?
I think we've already seen some fracturing of CCM. We've seen prominent critics come out, people like Josephat Gwajima, people like Humphrey Pole, who were previously aligned with the Magufuli wing of the party, have come out as critics. I think the challenge is that they have been effectively sidelined from the party. Humphrey Pole was reportedly abducted. His whereabouts remain unknown. So they've been able to remain on the fringes of the party rather than really impacting and kind of allowing any cracks to show externally in the CCM. And I would expect that situation is likely to hold in the short to medium term, but longer term we're looking at the elections in 2030 when President Samia's constitutional term will finish, and there will be competition again, factional competition within the CCM for that role. So that's an interesting question for the longer term.
Your take on that?
Well, I think this is what there's been calls for reforms in general in terms of the way the party does its internal processes, and it has been really challenged because of the nature of Tanzanian politics and the dominance that CCM has. In effect, any presidential candidate stands a very high chance of becoming a Tanzanian president. But again, I think externally it also reflects to a great extent the role of multi-party democracy in Tanzania. Tanzania is marking about 33 years since the reintroduction of multi-party state. But again, we are seeing more and more limited options, as my colleague likes to put it, in terms of a growing population, but with limited choices. Again, this election was really affected with the disqualification of opposition figures, and of course Tundu Lissu, who could have been, I think, President Samia's greatest challenger, who is facing treason charges. So you can see the limited space, and of course this, but together with CCM's internal party democracy on the downfall, it really affects the general outlook of democratic ideals in Tanzania.
All right. Fergus, Nicodemus and yourself have really talked about the no contest. So we had Tundu Lissu and still have him held on treason charges. We saw the Act Wazalendo candidate who was probably the second biggest contender disqualified. How much of a threat did they really pose to Suluhu at the ballot?
Well, I think that it is worth remembering the power of incumbency in Tanzania is really significant given the amount of power that the constitution vests in the presidency. So the president still has the power, for example, to appoint all electoral commissioners in Tanzania, as well as high court judges. And the constitution also means that there are no legal challenges allowed to election results. There are no legal challenges allowed whatsoever to any proclamations by the Electoral Commission. So in that sense, there is still a lot of kind of structural power that is vested in the ruling party, in the president, that does make it challenging, even under the conditions of a free and fair election, for opposition to challenge. That being said, Tundu Lissu had strong pockets of support in various parts of the country, and opposition strongholds, certainly in the north, potentially in the Lake Zone. And Luhaga Mpina, the ACT Wazalendo candidate, was a former ruling party MP who also had a high profile. But part of the challenge there is also these opposition parties don't necessarily have the deep networks and the funding to some extent to challenge CCM across the board, across Tanzania. So that's a longer-term challenge for democracy as well.
Okay. Nicodemus?
I tend to disagree with that. I think I look at the trajectory in terms of vote share, and CCM vote share has actually been declining even in the midst of what we call elections in the past. For example, in 2015, Magufuli was elected with 58%. And if you look at the time before him, you can see some form of dwindling in terms of CCM vote share. So I tend to disagree that the opposition does not have any chance in challenging. What I believe is the structural challenges within the electoral process and the electoral architecture of the country, which really constrain oppositions to participate fairly. If you look at the electoral, the electoral process, again, we cannot even, the people cannot actually challenge electoral results in court. The nature and the structure of the electoral commission is actually very partisan. And if you just also look at the way they even appoint the electoral officials, the electoral commission officials, it's largely by the executive. So you can see these institutional constraints that make it very difficult even for opposition to participate. So whereas there's this question of incumbency, the power of incumbency, or the historical dominance of CCM, but I look at it also from the institutional and structural challenges that are constrain the opposition to operate fairly.
Okay. Fergus, in your expert opinion, how do you see Samia Suluhu Hassan navigating her presidency moving forward? Do you expect that some of the concerns that were raised by protesters around legitimacy of the electoral process, for instance, will be addressed?
I think it will be challenging for her to address them, given that they're, again, the context of CCM and, some of those within her party who are eyeing up a potential shot at the presidency themselves, so will be resistant to potentially kind of deep-seated reforms of the Constitution. And I expect we may see something similar to what previously happened during kind of around the sort of 2023 period, where President Samia kind of took forward a task force on the Constitution that was supposed to put in place some kind of roadmap towards constitutional reform. So we may see similar processes as that, where it's kind of trying to kick the can down the road. Whether those, given what we've seen in the past few days, whether that type of approach is going to now satisfy citizens' demands, I find that increasingly unlikely. But there are other flashpoints here as well. Potentially the release of Tundu Lissu, if he, depending on the outcome of his trial, that's an outcome is due in early November. So we may see some developments on that front too.
How do you expect, Nicodemus, Tanzanians themselves will take this turn of events? Because Samia Suluhu Hassan today said those who participated in this protest were unpatriotic.
Well, I think with the events of the last few days, and this is very it has never happened in Tanzania. So I think in the days to come, things will not be operating as they have been in the recent past. Nobody expected that Tanzanians will go out and protest. And whereas we believe that the system will still continue controlling the narrative, I believe the pressure that has been put, especially by the protesters, and the fact that we have the official opposition leader facing treason charges, which many people believe are trumped-up charges, and of course increased spate of abduction and forced disappearances. I think there will be a lot of pressure from the public on the president, and I don't see a position where she can be able to really govern without really making some form of compromises going into the if at all into a 5-year term, and then because now she has been declared. So I believe there's going to be some form of dialogue and many compromises, and I think this will be the right time to push for reforms, especially by the demands for a new constitution, which I think is what Tanzania really needs going forward.
So you don't think she'll take even more of a hardline position?
I don't think if she can actually be able to do that, but I think the pressure that will be coming from the citizens, I think it's what they call it has broken that, they say, Tanzania will never be the same again. And I think she's going to be facing a more woke citizen, more citizens who are more aware. And of course, the circumstances that the continent is experiencing and the region in general, I believe there is no way that she will be adamant in maybe a hardline stance. All I think is for sanity to reign. I think it will be important for dialogue, and I think it will be important to really make concessions around critical issues that really ail the country.
All right. Lastly, Fergus, your last word. Nicodemus has made reference to dialogue, but when you look at the international community already, we've seen the African Union congratulate her on her win, and just concern from the UN Secretary General, as well as foreign ministers from, I think it's the United Kingdom, Canada, yes, and Norway. Just concern around violence and, an affront to civic liberties.
Yes, sorry, you wanted me to comment on the international community
yes.
Perspective. Yeah, I think there are challenges for how some of Tanzania's traditional development partners approach this situation over the coming days. We've seen fairly muted congratulations so far. The president of Burundi has sent congratulations. The chairperson of the African Union Commission, as you said. But I think there is a challenge for how some of those partners that have already issued critical statements are going to respond. But equally, this is a difficult. We're talking about a different global context now than perhaps a decade ago. A case of dwindling global aid budgets, of different partners available, diversity of partners available to countries like Tanzania. So there's also a kind of a more challenging line that some of these countries are going to try and walk in their diplomatic relations with Tanzania. So there are also questions there, for example, for President Ruto in the coming days of how his statement, which I assume will be congratulatory, mainly how that will be worded and how Kenyans will respond to that, given the reaction that we've seen from Kenyans online in the past few days.
All right. Thank you for speaking to us this evening. Fergus Kell, Research Fellow, Africa Program at Chatham House. Nicodemus Minde, Researcher, Institute for Security Studies. We will remain on the story as Citizen because, figures in terms of deaths have ranged from 10 to up to 500, 700. There's uncertainty on that, especially with the clampdown on the internet. So we wait to see how things will play out in the days to come. We take a break, but Citizen Weekend continues on the other side.